Paleo Runner Podcast is devoted to finding better ways to live, run, train, and eat. I'm your host, Aaron Olson. You can find more information by going to paleorunner.org. If you enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Search for Paleo Runner in iTunes and click ratings and reviews. You can also follow me on facebook.com/runpaleo or on Twitter @runpaleo. I wanted to take a minute to let you know about a product I've been using called 3Fuel. 3Fuel is a sports drink that gives you fat, protein, and carbohydrates to use as a fuel source. Unlike sugary sports drinks, 3Fuel gets absorbed slowly into your bloodstream to give you sustained energy throughout your workout. If you'd like to give it a try, you can get 10% off by using the coupon code 3FOLSON. Go to paleorunner.org and click 3Fuel at the top of the page. If you're listening through the podcast app on iPhone, click the link displayed on the app right now. My guest today is Professor Timothy Noakes. Tim is a medical doctor and exercise scientist who has published numerous journal articles and books, including Lore of Running, Waterlogged, and Challenging Beliefs. This is Tim's second time on the program. Tim, it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Aaron. A privilege to be with you again.
So, Tim, you have a really interesting background because you wrote the book, The Lore of Running, and you in that book, you said it's okay to eat a high-carb diet and lots of fruit and lots of pasta and things like that. How did you get to this point where you suddenly switched your opinion on that? Can you give our listeners a little bit of a background?
Yes, indeed, Aaron. What happened was it was the night I finished Waterlogged, which had been an epic 30-year production from the day we first described or met the first lady who got the condition 30 years ago to writing this book. So it was quite exhausting. I'd spent about 2 years compiling the book. And the night I finished it, my brain in the middle of the night said, you must get up tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock and you must go and run and you must stop and you mustn't run for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, I had been running, but I hadn't been running seriously. And so I went out the next morning at 6 o'clock with my Garmin and I chose a really flat 5K route around my house in the flattest area I could find. Mm-hmm. And the last bit of the run was up a hill and I went so badly and my heart rate was so high. I said, no, something's got to give. I've got to sort this out. I've got to get fit and healthy as I was once. And I realized the first thing I want to do is lose some weight. So by chance, and life is, by the millimeter. When I got home, I checked my emails and there was an email from advertising this book, which said lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks without hunger. And I said, but I know that's impossible because you have to be hungry to lose weight. So I was about to delete it. And then I noticed it was written by Steve Phinney and Jeff Volek. And then I said, but I know those guys. They're really serious scientists. We had done studies along the lines that they'd done on low-carb diets years ago. And I said, but these guys are serious scientists. So I looked at the name of the book. I said, well, I'm going to go and find it. So I went straight to our bookshop and they had the last copy. And I bought it and I brought it home and I opened it and it said there are 150 studies showing the value of a low-carbohydrate diet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, and all these are the benefits. And particularly if you're insulin resistant or carbohydrate intolerant. So I figured, well, maybe I'm carbohydrate intolerant. So let's give it a go. And by lunchtime, I said, that's it. And I said, I've eaten my last carbohydrate.
That is quite a coincidence that you just happened to see that advertisement in your email.
It couldn't have, if it had come another day and my mind wasn't ready for it, it wouldn't have worked. Uh-huh. So anyway, I had this incredible response. And within 6 weeks, my running improved profoundly. So from being someone who was really struggling to run and thinking it was just because I was old and run all these marathons, mm-hmm. I felt so much better. And so then I decided, okay, let's give it a go. And I've been on it for 3 years and I've not looked back. My health has just improved dramatically over those 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. And, I saw when I was doing a little research, I saw that there's an article just published about you and a medical journal an article you published in a medical journal where you document a lot of the people who have written letters to you. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the success stories that you've heard from people?
Yeah. It's so funny because there's been an outrage in South Africa that I've done public work. Uh-huh. And it's really interesting because there are a whole bunch of reasons explaining it. But this is a series of case reports, which as a medical doctor in a medical journal, you're allowed to write. Mm-hmm. And I didn't draw any conclusions other than to say we need a randomized controlled trial of this diet against the standard diet. That's all I said. I didn't say that this proves that the low-carb diet is healthy or beneficial or something. But in fact, they aren't anecdotes. So everyone said, Noakes is just an anecdotal scientist. He writes anecdotes and claims that they prove, which is the last thing. They're all paradoxes because all had been doing what they were told to do. They were told to eat a high carbohydrate diet and they got, like me, had got progressively sicker. And when they changed to a high fat diet, they all improved. And that's a paradox because you're not meant to eat fat to be
Mhm.
healthy. So the key is, and I managed to get 127 paradoxes. In fact, I've got many more, but let me give you the best examples. A guy called Billy Tosh. Now he arrives home in Cape Town. He's been on holiday up country and he can't fit into the seat, in the economy seat in the airplane. And he's so embarrassed because he overflows into the next seat. And the lady sitting next to him gets very angry and she harangues him for 2 hours on the flight. So he goes to his doctor that night and she says, listen, you've got diabetes and you've got hypertension and you're going to be dead by tomorrow morning unless you go to hospital. So he says, no, I'm not going to hospital. I will solve the problem myself. So he goes home and he goes on the internet and he immediately finds something I've written and he says, that's it. Here's Dr. Noakes saying you can eat lots of fat and lots of protein, and he's describing the diet that I love to eat. I'm going to try it. So he starts, and 28 weeks later, that is 7 months later, he loses 83 kilograms, which is times 2.2 is 170 pounds, roughly, a bit more than 170 pounds. So he loses 170 pounds in 28 weeks. He goes back to the doctor and she doesn't recognize him. And of course, she starts crying.
Oh, wow.
And now he uses this technique whenever his friends who haven't seen him for a year see him. He just goes up to them and starts talking and they haven't a clue who he is.
Wow.
So that was the one. Another guy lost 73 kilograms and made a big difference to him. And then there was a doctor who's become a great friend of mine, and he had diabetes, obesity, hypertension, high cholesterol, sleep apnea. In other words, he couldn't sleep at night without using a mask to allow him to breathe. And he had gout.
Mhm.
And he was 57-year-old, and he went to his wife and he said, I'm going to be dead by 65. You better make alternate arrangements for the rest of your life, you see. So he also hears me speak, and then he says he's also carbohydrate intolerant. He's going to stop the carbs. He drops 30 kilograms and he cures all those conditions. Every single one of them disappears, and he doesn't need any medication whatsoever anymore.
Wow.
And so he thinks I'm a miracle worker. And now, but the point was, of course, he's a doctor under the best specialist care that we have to offer in Cape Town. And he was on medication that was not curing his problem, because his problem ultimately was hunger. And he was always searching for food. And once we took his hunger away and got him off the carbohydrates, his body could heal of all those problems.
Mhm.
But then there've been a whole lot of sporting examples, but this is the best one, because this is a guy who at 37, he's been a good runner in the past. He was his best high school miler, and he's got progressively fat. He was always a little overweight, and he's got progressively fatter, and he's gone from 68 kilograms to 83 kilograms, which is 180 pounds or so. And so he was pretty lean as a schoolboy, but now he's got fat, and his running has deteriorated. And he runs one 35-mile race, which he normally runs about 5.5 hours, and he does 6 hours and 57 minutes, which means he just breaks the 7-hour cutoff.
Mhm.
And he's profoundly embarrassed because he's not running anymore. He's just walking and jogging.
Right.
And in fact, to lose weight, he decides he's going to run 9 marathons in 9 weeks. And all he does, he gains 6 pounds doing that. He figures maybe.
But he's running off all those calories, Tim. He should be burning gobs of weight.
That's exactly right. So anyway, he's very skeptical because he knows carbohydrates make you run faster. And how can Dr. Noakes say you should not eat carbohydrates?
Mm-hmm.
So he says, okay, I'm going to give Dr. Noakes 120 days. And he says, for 120 days, no alcohol, no carbohydrates. In the first week, he loses 2 kilograms. He says, gee, that's pretty good. I couldn't lose 2 kilograms before. And so it goes on. He continues to lose about 1 kilogram a week. And very quickly, he's 16 kilograms lighter. But most importantly, now his thighs have got thinner and they're not rubbing. So now he can train because limiting was his thighs always chafing.
Oh, man. That's a great story. Oh, go ahead.
And as he trains, he gets faster and faster and faster. And now he can train at distances he's never done before. So now he lines up with the same 35-mile race, which he did 6:57 the year before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in South Africa, there's a cutoff. If you do under 4 hours for that race, in other words, you have to run a marathon under 3 hours, and then you have to run another 9 miles in an hour. And those 9 miles are straight up a hill and then down the other side of the hill. It's a real tough final 9 miles to this race. So you run your marathon in under 3 hours, and then you've got 1 hour to run 9 miles on a really tough course. And to break 4 hours is considered one of the landmarks if you're sort of the average, better than average runner.
Mm-hmm.
So he lines up and he says, well, I just broke 7 hours last time. I wonder if I can break 4 hours. In other words, I can improve 3 hours. And he runs the race and he finishes in 3 hours, 59 minutes in 208th position. So he drops 7,400 positions in the
Oh
race.
my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's
And so
that's just
now,
incredible.
yeah, and so now he just completely changed his life. But it doesn't end there. Bruce Fordyce, who won the Comrades Marathon, the 90-kilometer or 56-mile race
Hmm.
in South Africa, and he's the legend in South Africa. He also put on weight with age. Even though he'd run 200 marathons, he put on weight and he got slower and slower and slower, and eventually decided he must also try this stupid cutting the carbohydrate. This is not going to work. And he drops his time 2 hours in the marathon. But at 56, he drops his time over 5Ks from 23 minutes to 17 at altitude. Now, running 17 minutes for 5 kilometers or just over 3 miles at 56 is pretty good. And then, in fact, he ran the New York City Marathon not last week, but a year ago, and he was the second finisher in his category, 55 and older.
Oh man, wow.
Yeah. So that means some of the exciting. So what people don't understand is I'm just reporting cases, and these are terribly important cases because they show in people who are doing what they were told to do, they get better when they're told to do when they do exactly the opposite of what they were told to do.
Yeah. Tim, now skeptics of that might say, well, I know you've personally written about the power of the brain, and especially in things like endurance sports. They might say, well, that's just a placebo effect. They believe the diet was going to work, and so maybe they cut their calories. What do you say to that?
Well, all of them will tell you that they lost their hunger, and that was the key, as I did. And I mean, as I sit here now 3 years later, I don't remember what hunger is anymore. It just never happens.
Okay.
And that's the beauty so what I've learned is that if you want to lose weight and control your weight, you have to get rid of hunger, because if you're hungry, you're never going to control your weight.
Right.
And that's what this diet does. It's, as you know, it's just amazing in its ability to control your hunger.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the low fat or high fat, low carb, is it something that can work for anybody, or are there some people that need some carbs?
It's really interesting. I was watching a lecture by Jeff Volek recently, and to me, he's the sort of the leading authority in the world because he's done the best studies.
Yeah.
So he really knows it. And he made a really interesting point. He says, if you put everyone on a low carbohydrate diet, they all respond exactly the same way. And he said, so it's a highly conserved evolutionary adaptation that humans have, that when we are exposed to low carbs, we respond the same way. And so he says that must have been the genetic adaptation, that we must have been exposed to low carbs most of our lives. But when you expose the same people to high carbohydrate diets, the response is completely different. There's a small percentage of people who are completely healthy on that. Well, I'm not sure they're completely healthy, but they're outwardly healthy on that diet. But for the majority, I think, and by that I mean 51% or more, on a high carbohydrate diet, they're not healthy, and their health is being damaged. So to answer your question, the more insulin resistant you are, the less carbohydrate you can eat in your diet.
Okay.
And for many of us, we become increasingly insulin resistant as we get older. We become pre-diabetic or we become frankly diabetic. And once you're pre-diabetic, frankly diabetic, your only hope is you've got to cut the carbs to an absolute minimum. And some people with pre-diabetes will reverse it, and some people with diabetes will reverse it. In my case, I couldn't reverse my diabetes. Maybe in the future I will be able to, but at the moment I'm hanging in there, controlling my glucose on a very low carbohydrate diet and taking medication and being very cautious, doing everything right. Yet I'm still clearly diabetic. So the tragedy was I waited too late, and that's why I'm so vocal about this. Because if I'd been 40 and gone to a lecture and there was Professor Noakes saying, listen, guys, if you're 40, you must have your HbA1c measured, you must have your glucose, you must have your insulin measured to see if you're pre-diabetic, I would have had it done. And I would have found that I was pre-diabetic. I would have cut the carbs and I would have been healthy.
Right.
And that's the message that I'm trying to get out.
Yeah. I had a guest on the show last week who's an advocate of a paleo-style diet, but he says that most people will do best at around 100 to 150 grams of carbs. Do you think that it's different for everyone? He says that there's things that the immune system might need to have a few carbs in the diet. Do you agree with that?
I'd like to see the evidence for that. I think that you don't just eat for your immune system. And once you're in my state where you can't regulate your glucose easily, glucose is going to be your killer. And it's damaging your brain all the time. It's damaging your arteries. Every time your glucose goes up, you're getting damaged and you're moving towards dementia and cancer and all those things. So for me, you've got to regulate your glucose. If in the cases he explains, the people their glucose is well regulated and they can eat 120 grams of carbohydrate and the glucose never goes above 6 and it's back to 5 within 30 minutes or an hour, then he's fine. That's absolutely right. I would have no problem with them eating carbohydrate. But if in eating that 120 grams, they were exposing their bloods to glucose going up above 7 millimoles. Sorry, I'm using the millimolar values. Okay. They're going up to 110, 120. That's not good.
Okay.
And in my own case, my immune function is just astonishingly good, and it never was. I haven't had a day of sickness since 3 years, and
wow.
And I had a whole bunch of illnesses which have all disappeared. So
yeah, do you think that's because of the low carb, or is it because of cutting out the grains, things like gluten and the paleo people say that there's a lot of toxins in grains. Do you think that could be part of this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It could well be the gluten, and because I got better immediately, I cut the cereals, and so I used to have headaches once a week, which I took powerful medication. I haven't had a headache in 3 years. And I know that's now the gluten and the gliadin, which were causing it from wheat, and I didn't know that at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had Professor Daniel Lieberman on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he came out with a book saying, that the paleo diet is probably really healthy, but it's not sustainable. That we can't feed the world on a paleo diet. Do you think that's correct?
Daniel's a genius, so I would hate to say something in conflict to what he says. But so what? That's not really a relevant argument. That doesn't mean to say we must now all eat carbs and die from it. we have to work out a middle road. But one of the people I work with in Cape Town is a lady called Leonie Joubert, who's written a fabulous book. She's gone throughout South Africa and looked at the hunger. He wrote a fabulous book called The Hunger Season. And she doesn't really agree with that entirely, because what we're doing now, in a lot of the meat that we kill, we destroy most of the nutrients. We take away the offal, the guts, and the brains and the bone marrow, which the Plains Indians considered the most important part of the animal. Mm-hmm. And we just throw it away. And we have to sort that out. But let me remind you what happened in the United States of America. In the 1700s, you guys had 60 million bison on the plains, and they were in perfect harmony with the plains. What you have today is 40,000 cattle and feedlots being fed by corn that is grown on these huge, vast estates in the Midwest, which is completely unsustainable. Without oil, that's unsustainable. Mm-hmm. So the corn industry is also unsustainable in the long term because it destroys the environment. It destroys all the animal life around that environment. So people have to see it both ways. And I've recently met a guy called Alan Savory in South Africa, who's from Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, as I was. And he has a fantastic talk on TEDx where he shows the only way you can sort out deserts is you've got to put large herds onto those desert areas. And they reverse the desertification. And he noticed that in northern Zambia, where he lives, it used to be northern Rhodesia, that the areas which are most pristine are kept pristine by the presence of large herds of antelope or cattle. Mm-hmm. And when you have lots of cattle, they break up the soil and they fertilize it. And then that is what you need. And then the environment works properly. The way we do it in the Midwest of the United States, that's not sustainable in the long term. Mm. So I'm not sure that Daniel has studied the whole details of it.
Okay, yeah.
And maybe he's right, but the answer is growing grain is also unsustainable in the long term.
Right. So, Tim, there's been a lot of talk in the endurance community lately about ketogenic diets and how that might affect your performance and maybe enhance your performance because ketones can be used as a great fuel for the brain. Are you in ketosis right now, and are you burning those ketones as fuel? And what do you think about those thoughts that, like Jeff Volek writes about, that they could be great for ultra-endurance athletes?
Oh, I think that no question that once an event lasts more than 5 hours, that fat-adapted athletes will have a benefit. And the further it goes, the better. And I think that's what he's is showing with the Western States 100-milers, that the winners there are now tending to be much more likely to be on the high-fat diet. Mm-hmm. The bit of his work that I really like, which is just coming through, and he discussed it with me, I saw him in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, that when you're in ketosis, you activate a whole bunch of enzymes that act against oxidative damage in the body. And what he's suggesting is that when you're running on high carbohydrates with the oxygenation of the tissues, you develop oxygen-free radicals. and that those cause damage and prevent you from recovering quickly. Whereas if you're ketotic, you in fact have activated the enzymes that clear up that oxidative stress, and so you don't damage yourself. And I think that's going to be the area. And I know for myself, although I'm 64 and a half, I can train hard most days and recover really quickly. I don't get stiff as I used to. And I think there's something in that you recover more quickly because there's something else going on, that on a high carb diet, you're doing some sort of damage that we haven't fully identified. So, sorry, to answer the question then, I think in a long distance event, if it's over 5 or 6 hours, burning fats is going to be advantageous for you. Because if you aren't, you're going to have to find the carbohydrates and stuff yourself with carbohydrates. Incidentally, just as an aside, Diana Nyad, who swam, from Cuba to Florida, I advised her and I said, listen, she wrote to me, she said, I keep getting nausea in the swim after about 70 hours or 80 hours. And I said, well, what are you eating? I said, just go back and eat real foods. Don't eat the goos and the rubbish. You don't need it. Just eat real foods. And she didn't. And when she finished, she wrote to me a few days later and she said, thank you very much. Now eating real foods, I didn't get sick. And so again, my point would be is once the event goes over 24 hours, you have to eat real foods during the event, not the carbohydrate, not the goos, because those goos will make you feel sick ultimately.
Right. And that goes to a question that I got on Twitter today. I tweeted that you'd be on the program, and I got a question. It says, I never hydrate or do very little hydration on long runs, and especially on race day. Gatorade kills my stomach. What can I do to prepare? I thought you'd like that question.
Sounds to me like he's preparing perfectly. And if you just take water or maybe milk, I'm not yet into knowing. I drink milk now when I don't race longer than half marathons, but if I did, I would drink milk or coconut oil nowadays, because it's so easy to digest and it feels fantastic and it tastes fantastic, or water. And if you're fully fat adapted, you take the fat with you in your fat cells.
Yeah.
And you just burn it. And as you know, you just get stronger the further you go.
Right.
So I think that your person who asked that question is doing very well, and they should just stick with the water.
And she says, I never hydrate on long runs. Do you think that's okay?
Well, if she was going to have a problem, she already would have had it.
So she's fine to just trust her thirst.
Yeah, exactly. And if she must get thirsty somewhere. You can't run 24 hours and not get thirsty. So sooner or later she's going to get thirsty, and at that point she should just take in some water.
Right. And you've ran Comrades Marathon, which is a 56-mile running race, several times. And what did they have carbohydrate replenishment on the race course when you were running?
Well, you ask a fabulous question, so I'll tell you the story. So when I ran my first one, 1973, what happened then, you had to get a car to go with you because there was no fluids, nothing available on the course, nothing whatsoever.
Really? Okay.
You had to have either a motor bicycle or a car, and it was entirely your responsibility. They provided absolutely nothing. They had to run 56 miles. And that you were not allowed to drink for the first 20 kilometers, so the first 13 or 14 miles, nothing was provided. And that's how, so the first 2 hours you ran and you just knew you weren't going to get a drink. Then you would see your guy who was helping you, if you were lucky, because now there's a whole bunch of runners, he might not miss you, might miss you. And then you would say, go 10 kilometers or 8 miles further on, and we'll meet you there. And again, the chances of you meeting him was still slim. He may or may not find you. So in that race, I think I probably had 4 or 5 drinks in the race.
Okay.
So then of course Noakes knows best, you see. So he tells the organizers they don't have a clue. They've got to provide fluids and more carbohydrates and things, because we were just getting into the carbohydrates then. And so slowly things changed. And by 1981, they then had provided a fluid station every mile. So now you had 56 stations by 1981. And 1981 was the first year we had a fluid overload case. So the first year they had, and then they were only giving water. And perhaps they were giving Coca-Cola, I can't recall. And then in 1982, by then I decided that carbohydrates were the whole solution and so on, and worked with Bruce Fordyce, and we developed a goo. It was the first goo global. and he won the race using the goo, you see. So then, therefore, that was the right solution.
Right.
So we were the first in the world to start producing these goos, and it's still available. It's called FRN for Fordyce, for Bernard Rose, who's a friend of ours, and Noakes, FRN.
Okay.
That was the first goo that was available. So I was completely accountable for the carbohydrate belief in marathon running.
So why do you think it's so hard to get concrete answers in fitness and nutrition? I mean, it
Yeah,
seems like you've got some people doing the high carb diet like the Kenyans. You've got some
yeah.
people doing low carb, some people doing high mileage, some people do low mileage. How do we get concrete answers, and why is it so difficult?
It's difficult because there's no funding, and that's part of the problem.
Hmm.
And the other problem is that the best studies which we're hoping to do now, we're going to take fat runners because they're an interesting group, you see, because they're doing lots of exercise and they can't understand why they're not thin.
Hmm.
And like Simon Gear, the guy I told you about who lost 16 kilograms and dropped his ultra marathon time by 3 hours, they're carbohydrate intolerant and they eat lots of carbohydrates and they get fat. And that's the group we need to target on first. We've got to look at them and say, fine, let's see what happens when you go on a high fat diet or a high carbohydrate diet. And then we will show dramatic improvements in performance in terms of, hours in the marathon and tens of kilograms. And then we will know for at least some in the population who are carbohydrate intolerant, eating carbohydrates makes them go slowly and eating fat makes them go fast.
Hmm.
And that would be the first. And so we can identify, okay, fine. There are going to be people who are carbohydrate tolerant and they can eat their carbs and they'll be fine. And then maybe we should look at them because we have done those studies in the past. We've looked at healthy people and put them on high fat diets. And generally they don't do any better, but they by and large don't do worse.
Hmm.
And we've never tested them over more than about 2 hours or 3 hours in the laboratory.
Okay.
And that's too short. You see, you've got to go the longer distances. But I'm amazed that very few of them actually do worse, which you would think don't do worse.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the point. I think that the Kenyans, are clearly highly carbohydrate tolerant, at least when they're young.
Hmm.
What we don't know, however, is the guys who stayed in Kenya and who didn't make the international teams.
Hmm.
They could be carbohydrate intolerant and a kilogram too heavy, so they don't make it.
Right.
And if they cut their carbs, they might improve. But we don't know that.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up. I think Nassim Taleb talks about that in Fooled by Randomness, is that you have to look at the graveyard and see what athletes didn't make it, and if they had tried something different, maybe they would have done better. We often forget to look at the counterfactual, and the guest I had on last week, Paul Jaminet, said that saturated fat is such a good source of energy to use during running that he would love to see the Kenyans try out a slightly higher fat diet and see what happens. That'd be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got another question from Facebook, and this person's name he goes by the name of Irish Runner. He says, "What should we eat and drink during an ultra marathon?" And he's worried about sodium and electrolyte intake.
Mm-hmm. Well, sodium and electrolyte is simple. You don't have to bother about them because your body will sort that out. And when you're running the marathon, your body is excreting the excess sodium that you took the day before. That's what it's trying to get you into balance. It's the poor body is always trying to get rid of this excess sodium. It's always battling to get rid of it. And when you go and run and you sweat, it says, thank goodness I'm not getting rid of it in sweat. I don't have to get it out in the urine. And so I can conserve a bit of potassium and so on and so forth. So sweating is a great way of getting rid of the excess sodium in your body. And you most definitely don't need to replace it. And the studies, and I've discussed them in Waterlogged, show that if you take salt in your in your sports drink, you pass it out in urine in the next 24 hours. And you have to because you're already in excess.
Okay.
So because we evolved on the African savanna and we had so little sodium in our diets, we are great sodium conservers. And yet now we give ourselves this massive sodium overload and we just don't need it. I don't think it's dangerous. If you're eating a moderate or low carbohydrate diet, your blood pressure will normalize because it's carbohydrates that drive blood pressure, not salt. And that's another message that we have to get out. Mm-hmm. So if you're eating an excess salt and you're eating a low carb diet, that's fine. But on the other hand, if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet and you're salt sensitive, then it's a problem because your blood pressure will be elevated.
Okay.
So the message is simple. You never need to take sodium supplementation at all.
Even during, say, a 100-miler?
No, never.
Mm-hmm.
Again, your body is only too pleased that you're getting rid of all that excess.
Okay.
And if it senses that you're going to lose too much, it'll just reduce the excretion in your urine.
Okay.
So the key is when your urinary sodium, when there's no sodium in your urine, then you're deficient, not when there's no sodium in your sweat. Mm-hmm. And that's the error that people made.
Okay. I've got another question from Kathy Morgan. She says, I'm running a 5K on Thursday, 10K on Friday, a half on Saturday, and a full on Sunday. And this will be her first race fat adapted. How do you recommend she fuel for something like that? And she also says, have you heard of a product called UCAN? And what do you think about using it during the race?
Great question. Firstly, obviously she shouldn't be doing these races, but I understand. So just take it calmly and don't try to win the 5 and the 10. Rather try to win the marathon.
Mm-hmm.
So, focus on the last 10K of the marathon. That's when you can start racing. But you can't start racing the 5 or the 10 or the half. You race the last 6 miles, 5 miles of the marathon.
Mm-hmm.
And she should just eat as her body dictates. So if she's eating high fat diet, her body will tell her, I want more fat now. And then she should eat it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if she's fully fat adapted, having the carbohydrates isn't really going to help, but she doesn't need it.
Mm.
She must just continue to eat the fats both before and during the races.
Mm-hmm.
And if she's fully adapted, she's fine. The problem is, I think some people's livers are not fully adapted and they struggle to produce enough glucose. So ideally, if you wanted to do it scientifically, she'd measure her glucose when she's running let's say the half marathon at halfway or about at halfway and at the finish, and see what happens to your glucose. And if it's fine, that's fine. And also in the marathon. Too many people start to take carbohydrates because they think their blood glucose is low, but actually she should measure it and see.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not low, she doesn't need carbohydrate.
Okay.
And it's a very simple thing to measure.
Right.
To have one of these glucometers and just to measure your glucose is very simple to do.
Yeah. And have you heard about some of these newer products that are out there that they actually contain a starch, but it's very slowly digested?
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that?
Well, Peter Attia, who has been promoting this, and I think Jeff Volek as well, and it seems to me it acts almost as if it isn't a carbohydrate.
Right.
In other words, it doesn't cause insulin secretion, and that's the key. You don't want insulin secretion because that messes up all your metabolism. Mm-hmm. So, yes, that's fine. I just don't know how it's being metabolized. So that would be the interesting question.
Right.
And what's happening to it, whether it's actually entering the bloodstream and being used as a carbohydrate. It doesn't make sense to me how it's being used, because it has to appear in the bloodstream as glucose. And as soon as it does that, it should get an insulin response. So I don't know. But again, there are many things we don't understand and don't know. And if we try to explain it on the basis of our standard knowledge, we're usually wrong. So I have great respect for Peter and Jeff. And if they find that it's helpful, then please go ahead and try it.
Mm-hmm. Tim, I've got another question from Brian McKenzie, and he asks, what are your thoughts on high mileage running? Do you still think it's a good approach? We see Ryan Hall, who seems to keep getting injured, who's America's fastest runner, yet the African runners seem to have careers that last for years.
Well, I'm not sure about the latter statement. The Kenyans turn over very quickly, but it might be because there's so much competition at the top level. So I'm talking about the Kenyans in Kenya. Mm-hmm. I don't have the data for the Kenyans in North America, the professional runners who've made it in a sense and don't have to race every weekend. So that I'm quite happy to accept that some of the Kenyans may have very long careers, but they don't all have long careers. And incidentally, one of the keys to the Kenyans is they rest for 2 months a year. They go and get fat. They put on a kilogram and then call themselves fat. So I remember Mark Allen has always been my heroic triathlete because he was at the top for 14 years. And I asked him, Mark, how did you do it? And he said it was simple. I had 2 months a year completely off, and I had 3 months of low intensity training at a heart rate below 150, and then I'd had the 7 month competitive season. Okay. And I think that's the key. You must only train really hard for 7 months of the year maximum. Mm-hmm. And you need this 2 months off and 3 months gentle training. When I say gentle, I mean it's quite hard, but it's not flat out training. And then you've got a competitive season.
Okay.
And I think what happens is that people just don't ever give their bodies a chance. They're too scared to stop training for 2 months. And that's stupid because your body will recover dramatically during that time.
Mm-hmm. So do you take a recovery period during the year?
Oh, yes, I take 2 months where I cut right back and I don't care what I do. I'll run twice a week or 3 times a week and absolutely not worry at all about training. And if I don't, I will crash. I crash after 7 months of training. I'll crash. Okay. And I get sore and stiff, and if I can't run fast anymore, and I've got to stop training. And
now that you're on the high fat diet, you don't gain weight anymore, I'm assuming.
Exactly. And
isn't that interesting?
No, absolutely. I mean, I can. By the way, one other point. Sorry, I've converted from a heel striker to a 4-foot striker. I'm not fully 4-foot, but I'm much better than I ever was in 40 years running. And my calf muscle injury just disappeared. And I had them for 40 years. And all of a sudden, as one of my colleagues said, your muscles, you're now using the muscles the way they're meant to be used. They're meant to be eccentrically loaded, and then they contract. And the only way you can do that is by landing on the front of your foot.
Right.
So my injuries are much less. I had a bit of strain around the knee for about a year when I adapted, and my Achilles tendon struggled a bit, but now they're fine. So definitely adapting to training. But to come back to your point, so I was injured for a month and I didn't train and my weight went down 0.6 of a kilogram. And that was, in the past, it would have gone up 4 or 5 kilograms. Yeah.
Okay. Are you still running in the Newtons?
Yes, I'm using the Newtons, and I don't want to advertise shoes, but I'm using the Adidas Balance as well because that gives me just enough cushioning.
Okay.
And it's quite, and I can run on the forefoot of that in that shoe.
Okay.
But both those shoes I found have been the Newton helped me start running in the front of my foot.
Okay, so what do you think about the latter part of his question? The idea, what do you think, is high mileage still a good approach? There's been a lot of people like Mark Sisson who kind of advocate for a lower mileage approach, maybe more interval type training. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Mark, as I read it, has gone completely against the sort of marathon running argument.
Yeah.
and he's living in Malibu and he's on the beach every day. I think I'd also, we do more surfing than running.
Yeah.
So I think he's in a unique environment. So he's very fortunate. And I'm sure there's something to it that perhaps there is a certain amount of running that's beneficial and a certain amount that is not. I think that the outcome is if you want to be a good runner for 5 or 6 years, you do have to do high mileage. And I think you have to go back to what Arthur Lydiard wrote. And I think I just tend to think that he had it right on you have to do the high volume training to be successful. Again, why haven't we had clinical trials where we compare higher mileage runners to guys doing high intensity and lesser mileage? We really don't know. We're still speculating, but just on the history of what people have done, it's very difficult to be competitive in the marathon or further unless you do a long base of a lot of high mileage.
Mm-hmm. And you've written a lot about this idea of the central governor. How do you think high mileage helps your brain to adapt to faster running? Because it seems the opposite. If you're doing high mileage, a lot of running is at a slow pace, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it has to be. It's quite correct. And let's take the example, of the Tour de France cyclists who do go every day and cycle 6 hours a day. Biologically, if you do 6 hours cycling every day, after a couple of weeks, you're adapted to it. There's no more adaptation.
Okay.
That's how the body adapts. As far as I understand it, the biological adaptations occur relatively quickly. We could argue it's 3 weeks. We could argue it's 10 weeks. We could argue it's 3 months. But they do this religiously year after year after year. And I have to think that what's happening is that they're adapting their brains to believe that they can actually do 6 hours a day of this incredibly demanding sport.
Okay.
And that's what they're stretching. And I think that running is the same, that you're doing the distance running. Because you can't train the marathon distance at the pace you eventually run it at.
Right.
It's impossible. So how do you train for it? Well, I think you do high mileage and you train when it's difficult because you're a bit sore and you learn to do that. And then when you get into the race and it's sore, you've been there before.
Right.
I find for myself, if I haven't trained and I want to get through a race, I have to just go and do one long run. That's all. And it doesn't matter how slowly I do it, but if I just get out there for 2 or 3 hours, that in the run, it's much better. It's much easier. And it takes one exposure to a long run to get me ready for a longer run.
Okay. What are your thoughts on strength and conditioning programs for runners?
Yeah, I think they're underestimated. I think that there is a component of muscle strength that's important in running. And again, people have asked, when's a guy going to run under 2 hours? And the answer is that in 2 hours, you can only take so many footfalls. You only so many steps. So if you want to run the marathon under 2 hours, you've got to run further with the same number of steps. And that means every step has to be more powerful. Every muscle contraction has to be more powerful. And I would argue that the reason no one's running under 2 hours is because their muscles are not strong enough yet. And how they're going to get stronger? I doubt that it's going to happen with gym training, but some genetics is going to have to come along, and people with stronger muscles need to appear in the near future. But my point is that I think strength training for muscles is important in the lower legs if you want to be a better runner. If you've got endless time and you can go and run for 2 hours a day, go and run for 2 hours a day. But if you can only run half an hour a day and you've got 10 more minutes, don't add another 10 minutes running, go and do weight training in the gym 3 or 4 times a week. And I'll bet that that'll give you more benefit than adding 10 minutes running onto your 30 minutes of running.
Okay. So Tim, what have you learned? I mean, you've been doing this for the past 3 years now, and I'd also like to talk about maybe just as we finish up what you've learned since you first started and what you're working on next.
Well, Aaron, it's a great question because my career as an academic is coming to a close at the end of next year. So I turn 65 at the end of next year. And then in South Africa, we stop work at 65. And so I'm not going to have the same career that I've had in the past where I was running a big department and could choose the research I wanted to do. And so I have got certain constraints. And I've decided to focus more on the low carb diets and particularly the health components. At the moment, the research we've been able to raise money for, I've decided I wanted to become an expert in liver glucose production because I think that's the first defect that you get in diabetes. And if you want to understand diabetes properly, you have to understand why does the liver continue to produce too much glucose when your glucose concentration in the blood is so high. And we know, in fact, we only know now because it was shown a few weeks ago, that the first defect in diabetes is not that the muscles can't take up glucose. It's that the liver overproduces glucose. So we're setting up a model to measure that in people who are adapted to the high-fat diet. And I suspect one of the key adaptations to a high-fat diet is you normalize your blood glucose production. And once you do that, it's very probable there's a whole bunch of other adaptations that become normal. And I'm interested in because diabetics, like myself, are told that we have to eat lots of carbohydrate to keep our blood glucose normal, which is bogus. We can't keep it normal because it's already too high. And why would we want to add more carbohydrates? And we know that if you take a diabetic and you put them on a no carbohydrate diet, their blood glucose control improves dramatically. And that has to tell us that they're going to do better in the long term. So at the moment, we're looking at people eating high-fat diets and have adapted for a year at least on a very high-fat diet. And we're measuring their liver glucose production and their metabolism during exercise and working out now where are they getting the glucose from? Where's it being produced from? From protein and fat, obviously, but in what rate and what rates are they producing? And we're going to say, listen, you can put a person on a very low carbohydrate diet and the liver's fine. It can produce all the glucose you like. So why would you want to feed a diabetic who's already overproducing glucose more carbohydrate? And then I would like to look at diabetics and see if we can normalize glucose production. And if when you normalize glucose production, then the diabetes so-called disappears. And that would be the next step. And then when we raise 3 million rands, which would be about $300,000, I want to go and find the fat runners and the fat cyclists. By that I don't mean fat. I mean that they're a little large, a little chubby, and start working with them and show that a high proportion have insulin resistance. And you see, in my country, our medical students are not taught that there's even a condition called insulin resistant. And you have to ask why. I mean, I had a debate last year with the leading diabetologist, and he said insulin resistance doesn't exist. And I thought, now hold on, we've known insulin resistance exists since the 1960s, and you're telling me it doesn't exist, and you're a diabetologist. How can you manage these patients? So my point would be, I want to show that, let's say 70 or 80% of fat runners are insulin intolerant, despite the fact that they're running. So why? And the answer is because it's a genetic disorder. And see, that's the other argument that what we teach in South Africa and perhaps in many medical schools in the United States is that what happens is you get lazy and you get fat and then you get insulin resistance and then you get diabetes. I don't think it's that way at all. I think you have the genes, the abnormal genes, like I do because my father had diabetes and I've handed on right to my children. I know that because we've done tests and been able to show it. So it's gone right through the family. And so for example, now I'm lean, but I'm still profoundly insulin resistant. So it wasn't the leanness. So it wasn't the obesity that was causing my diabetes. I believe it was the genes. You then eat a high carbohydrate diet and you turn the excess carbohydrate into fat. And then eventually you're completely insulin resistant or diabetic. So it's a genetic disorder, which is made worse by a high carbohydrate diet. It's not that you're lazy and gluttonous and you don't exercise and then you get fat. And if you just stop being gluttonous and lazy, we'll reverse the diabetes. I don't think it's that at all.
Right.
You've got to focus on the carbohydrates, which is what the cause of the problem is. And many people are reluctant to do that because they are fixated on the fact that fat is bad for you. So what if we tell you carbohydrates are bad for you? Well, then you're going to start eating fat and that's going to kill you from heart disease. So it's a conundrum. How do we get out of it?
Yeah.
And I would like to show that the real explanation is that this is a genetic disorder, that people like myself have a propensity to develop diabetes because we're insulin resistant and we can do all the exercise we like. if you continue to eat a high carbohydrate diet, you will develop diabetes in the long term.
Mm-hmm. And are you also working on a book? I've heard a cookbook or some type of book that to kind of showcase the diet that you've been following.
I'm so glad you should ask, because on July the 4th this year, that's a few months ago, I met with two guys who are chefs, and they both endurance athletes, and one of them, David Greer, has done amazing runs. He ran the length of the Wall of China. The first two guys to do it in its entirety. And then 8 years ago, he was running in Mongolia, and I don't know quite what the run was. He raises money for fabulous charities. But anyway, he's running in Mongolia, and he was really struggling. And the Mongolians came up to him and said, listen, if you want to continue on this run, there's only one solution. You have to eat this food. And they handed him pork fat. They said, you will eat pork fat for the next 2 months and you will finish the run. And he ate the pork fat for I don't know how long, and he finished the run. And he said, then he realized that fat was what you need for exercise, not carbohydrate. Anyway, the story was the two of them came and they said, listen, we've got 140 recipes. We'll put the recipes together. You put the science together, and we'll bring in on board a nutritionist who will tell us what you should be eating. And we put a book together. And you won't believe it. Within 3 months, we had finalized the book, and the first issue had already been printed. And it arrived in Cape Town tomorrow morning.
Oh, fantastic.
It should be on sale in about 10 days' time.
Okay.
And it's called The Real Meal Revolution, and the cover has a cleft hand, a cleft fist, holding a knife and a fork. And so this is the revolution, and we all have red berets and things, and red t-shirts. The revolution has started in South Africa.
Oh, that's great. And is that going to be available on Amazon?
It will be, yes, and it will definitely be, and also Kalahari.com, which is the local distributor in South Africa, and it's not an ebook yet, but it will be becoming in due course.
Okay.
And we're really excited because what happened in the last 2 weeks, I've been profoundly criticized in the media. There's been a feeding frenzy on Tim Noakes, this dreadful scientist who claims all sorts of things and claims miracle cures because of that article in South African Medical Journal. And so we've polarized everyone. You either think Tim Noakes is fantastic, or you think he's the biggest fraud that's ever hit South Africa. And the book is going to come right at the moment when everyone is debating. It's a national issue.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So what are some of those? What did you have for breakfast and lunch today?
Oh, great question. I actually had very little for both.
Oh, really? So are you fasting today?
No, that's not true. So what I had for breakfast, because I had to go and give lectures, and it was a kind of a TEDx talk. So I got up very early this morning, and I had some cheese and almond butter on a thin piece of rye vita, which I shouldn't be eating, but I haven't yet got the bread from our new cookbook. The cookbook there has got the perfect bread, the way you make bread paleo style, and we'll be soon doing that. Okay. So anyway, that's what I had for breakfast, and I had nothing for lunch. I came home after the talks, and I had some salmon, which we ate 2 nights ago, with cream cheese and something else, other very high creamy dish, and it was just delicious. So that was my cold salmon, was my afternoon snack before, and then dinner we would have something to the dinner. I don't know what we'll have tonight. Probably eggs and ham, I would guess, and some fantastic vegetables as well. But that's typically what I eat, and it's almost nothing compared to what I used to eat. Yeah.
And you don't have any hunger.
I never have hunger. It's just amazing. But when I see food, I get full so quickly. It's just astonishing. If it's nutrient dense food,
right?
I eat one meal a day now, essentially. And it could be breakfast, or people ask me out to lunch, then lunch will be my big meal, or it could be dinner. But generally, I prefer mornings or lunchtime, because if I have a large meal at night, my glucose control is not so good the next morning.
Okay. Where's the best place where people can keep up with what you're doing? Is it Twitter? Do you have a blog?
Yeah, no, well, we're about to start a website, and it's been planned for February.
Okay.
So I'm planning to release, and then I will be blogging regularly.
Oh,
and
fantastic.
my goal will be to provide information, because over the last 3 years, I've read at least 100 books on diet, and about 1,000 articles. And the information is all there. It is so overwhelming that most of us should be reducing our carbohydrates. And the counter argument is so weak and not sustained by the evidence. But we just have to get it out there, and that's what the website will be focusing on. Good, solid scientific evidence collated from all these good scientists around the world who are doing fabulous work. and hoping to drive this paradigm shift, which has to happen. And I think every day it's getting closer. And this is an analogy from the Second World War, and I know it's a British analogy, and Americans may not understand it because you guys were great on the D-Day and saved the world from D-Day onwards with Eisenhower, Patton, and so on. But what saved us before that was General Montgomery at El Alamein, and there were many South Africans at El Alamein. And what happened at El Alamein, he was driven, the whole British forces were driven to this little destination which had a seaport, and the whole of Rommel's army was surrounding them, and Montgomery was sent to El Alamein. He said, you have to win the war for us. You have to beat Rommel or the British aren't going to win the war. And he sat tight at El Alamein. He just sat there waiting, collecting all this information, collecting all the tanks and all the people he needed until he knew he had to win. And on that moment, he attacked Rommel and drove Rommel back out of North Africa. And I kind of feel that that's where we are today. The paleo movement is sitting there with Field Marshal Montgomery. We're collecting all this information, which is incontrovertible. And eventually it's going to explode out. And we're going to drive everyone back into the sea and recapture science and recapture the world and win the war.
Yes, yeah.
But we're there, and people won't understand that it was one battle. It was Tobruk and El Alamein, which turned the war in the Allies' favor, and that we're at that point now. We're about to turn the war in our favor.
Yeah, we're there. Well, Tim, it's been great talking with you today. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer some of these questions and just share your story about what you've learned. Is there anything before we go that I didn't mention that you need to tell, endurance athletes, or do we pretty much cover everything?
I think, Aaron, the key is that you must always experiment. And Bruce Fordyce said it brilliantly. He said, some people say they've run the Comrades Marathon 10 times. He says, no, they ran it once and they just repeated that same failure 10 times. We're all individuals, and you have to read and experiment with yourself and understand the role of your character in determining your outcomes, because if you're always overtraining, you will always overtrain, in which case better get a coach to make sure you don't overtrain. And I'm a classic in that case. I would do much better with a coach who would tell me not to overtrain. So I think that the key, so best to get people to help you, but for goodness sake, experiment and don't discount anything. There's always a possibility that minor changes will make a difference. And just keep experimenting. And I think the other point is that you want to, people want to be, I'm 64, I want to be running at 80 and 90. And I started at 19 or 18, I think it was, and I'm still running at 65. And I swear every day I love my run as much as I did in fact, probably more than I did when I was 18. And I feel incredibly privileged to be able to run at my age and to enjoy it as much as I do. And I think that people take the long term, I haven't always enjoyed my running as much as I do now, but it's incredibly privileged to. And people say, you're such a happy, contented person, and why is that? And I said, because I found the secret, and the secret was running. And I discovered it, and running I was made to run, and not that I'm a great runner or I'm physically small enough to be a great runner. I'm big and ungainly, but it's when I get out there after 5Ks, I'm in heaven, and I discovered that. And so my message is, really enjoy it, experiment, find out what works for you. But at the end of the day, the fact that you ran a bad marathon last weekend couldn't be less consequential. What is consequential is that you're just enjoying it, and that you're still enjoying it at 60 or 70 or 80. That's the key.
That's great advice. And I just want to thank you again. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, Tim.
Thanks, Aaron, and a privilege to chat to you, and thanks for your fabulous questions, and also thanks to your listeners for putting together such nice questions.
You've been listening to another episode of Paleo Runner Podcast. For more information, go to paleorunner.org. Thanks for listening.